Welcome to the first episode of Liberation Through Love, because where love leads, healing can emerge. Creating this podcast is an act of love from Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse. We believe that where we are safe to heal, we are free to be. My name is Anna Harper. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Emerge. My partner and colleague, Sharonda Jordan, who's our Vice President of Organizational Development, would have joined us today, but had a last-minute family issue to attend to. So Sharonda, we're sending you all our love. Every day throughout this organization, there are so many informal, heartfelt conversations about our work, our love for our community, and the stories of pain and resiliency of survivors that never leave these walls. We also know that so many folks across our community are supporting each other with navigating experiences of abuse, violence, oppression, and trauma, and they are creating healing spaces that work for their community. We hope that this podcast will become a container for the love, healing, and brilliance, and serve as a tool to help bridge all of the critical work and leadership across our community. When we are in loving, healthy relationship, we can work together to heal and transform our communities. To help us launch Liberation Through Love, we have a couple of guests here today. April Ignacio is a mother, advocate, and survivor. She's a member of the Tano Atam Nation, and April is a co-founding member of Indivisible Tano, which is a grassroots organization that provides opportunities for civic engagement. April has been a part of the Arizona Study Committee for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls since its inception. She was recently appointed by Governor Hobbs to serve on the new Arizona State Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Task Force and helped lead the effort to establish a local task force here in Pima County focused on addressing the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people locally. We also have Javi Ramirez, who serves as the Director of Men's Engagement at Emerge. He's a social justice advocate, father, and partner who is deeply committed to promoting healthy relationships and gender equity. In a couple of minutes, April and Javi will share a little more about their work, but before we dive into that conversation, I want to provide a little setup and framework for today's conversation. Earlier this month, as a part of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and while we leverage this month to get the word out and increase awareness, I also have to say that domestic abuse and violence matters every day, not just during October. But we had earlier this month, we launched a new space called Lunchtime Insights, a bite-sized Emerge presentation. And this will be an ongoing monthly space where we will feature an educational or informational presentation, as well as provide information for community members who are interested in supporting our work through employment, volunteering, and any other ways that people see fit. But in that session, we shared information about a community-based model of understanding violence. And we talked at length about the connection between what we call systemic and community conditions and the prevalence of domestic abuse. In fact, domestic abuse is not a problem of individual people or a problem of certain relationships, but it's a product of historical, systemic, and community conditions. And that's to say that often our community's response or lack of response to abuse, and is the very thing that teaches and reinforces the violence. Emerge is always going to focus on providing individual support to survivors and those causing harm so that they may be safer. We're also going to focus on their loved ones, but we also know that we have to work to untangle the roots that hold violence in place and return power to those impacted by the violence so that their needs and their vision for safety are engaged in the solutions that we create. Now, this is a huge concept to unpack, and there are many nuances to understanding it all. So today's discussion is not going to be a complete conversation and will likely only scratch the surface of understanding. And so as we move forward and record new episodes, we'll take deeper dives into each of the topics. So with that, I want to give space to our guests to share about their work. And we'll go ahead and start with April. So April, tell us about your work and to be involved in the way that you are.
Thank you for having me. I want to first and foremost say thank you. Building this relationship with Indivisible Tono and Emerge Tucson has been very beneficial for our community and in ways that have given us opportunities and a larger platform to share the work that we have been doing in our community for the last 5 years. So in 2018, well, let me just take a couple steps back. So for the last, I would say 20 years, I have been helping coordinate the traditional women's games for the Tono of the Nation. And we host the largest tournament of Toca. Toca is compared to field hockey and it's only played by women. And so we have probably around 300 women who participate in this tournament every year. And around 2017, 2018, our tribe recognized my mom for basically revitalizing the game. And in that, we were given a field and a space named after her. And so, being a very idealistic individual, I thought, okay, this gives us a platform to talk about issues that impact the women on my tribe. So utilizing that space to have at least 14, it varies from 12 to 14,000 people a year who come and visit the nation during our rodeo and fair in February. It's the largest event we hold, and so because we have this space, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we saw it sort of fan through Canada and up on the north boundaries of the United States sort of make its way down. And a lot of that had to do with social media, the impacts of social media, and sort of just taking a step back and looking at MMIWG and seeing how are we connected to this, and basically started to connect the dots of the people in my own community, and started, just talking to community members who I knew were impacted by violence. And then utilizing the space during our rodeo and fair to highlight that, to bring awareness, and then give that story a platform. And so my unintended research began to snowball in my community with individuals providing information. And that's sort of how it all began on my res. Like, we knew it was there, but no one had connected the dots at that point. So this was right around 2018. And so now, because of that, we see how that has impacted Arizona. Because Navajo Nation, there are individuals in those communities who are doing the exact same thing. And there were people who were utilizing social media to spread awareness, but it wasn't going further than just those smaller circles. And I think just being civically engaged and being able to talk with our elected leadership and holding them accountable and actually bringing these things to light has given all of us the opportunity to share how violence has impacted our community, and not just with the current situation, but throughout history, and how that history of colonialism has impacted tribes, and you think about the environment and how that impacts the land we live on, and we see how all of those issues are intertwined, and it's not something that can be untangled. Like, it has to stay that way in order for people to realize how colonialism has perpetuated even today, and it's seen in some of the other topics we're going to be talking about today. Yeah. So I think for me, it's being home and connecting dots.
Yeah. I never knew that about your mom. And the toca. Yeah. I'm trying to say it like Spanish, but it's not toca, right? Is that how you say it?
Toca, yeah.
Toca. What's your mom's name?
My mom, her name was Verna Enos.
Verna Enos. We need to say that name
Yeah.
in this podcast. I didn't know that was connected to your mom. I've seen, if y'all follow April on social media, sometimes you'll see on Instagram, she'll post photos of the tournaments, and it's really cool to see. So I encourage y'all to find April Ignacio on Instagram and follow so that you can see that, and also, to go out to cells and support those events is really important. But I never knew that about your mom. And just to kind of put a fine point on it, when we talk about the connection to colonialism and the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the connection is that when this land was taken, rape and murder of women and girls was a tool that was used to take over, right? To create such hopelessness and trauma, to make it so that, right, if you're embedded in that kind of trauma in a moment where your loved one is being harmed in that way, it's a lot harder to fight back. And that strategy of using sexual assault and rape and murder of women and girls is something that persists today. We know that. So I wanted to make sure that we put a fine point on it, because the work that you're doing, April, to make this visible, to tell those stories, is it's sort of a way, I think, of like fighting back against how that has happened for so many years. And we're talking thousands of years without people even knowing.
Yeah, that they're participating.
Yes, like without people even knowing that there are all of these women and girls who from indigenous communities, native communities, that have been murdered or taken. And that's by design.
And I also think too, we also need to make sure that we acknowledge that the borders here play a large role in that perpetuating the violence. My work is focused primarily on Native Americans here in the United States, as we know. But there's a lot of this same situations happens, in across borders, and I mean like in Canada and Mexico and further south, and unfortunately, I don't have the capacity to do all of that work. But there are women, and that's the other thing too, is understanding and realizing that women are at the forefront of this movement, because in a lot of times systematic changes can only happen with grassroots groups, and a lot of those are women who are challenging the changes in systems. And I think one of the really interesting things that we have embarked on with our relationship with Emerge is getting men involved in this whole change, right? This community change, and how we invest in our community, and how do we ensure that our communities learn healthy ways to coexist. And so I think that being a part of, or working relationship with Emerge has given us a different outlook and approach in the way we work with men.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a great segue to have Javi introduce himself and share a little bit about your work and how you came to be here.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, April. We know each other, but it's really cool to hear some of your story too. I don't think I've heard those things before. My name's Javi Ramirez, and I'm the director of men's engagement at Emerge. So at Emerge, I help with, just coordinating our men's education program, which is a program, we call it an abusive partner intervention program. That's kind of a technical term. That is, any man who is charged with domestic violence here in Pima County usually has to take a set of classes as a result of that charge. So this class serves as, like a requirement for that. But our model is really different, which I'm hoping we'll talk more about today, in that we're hoping to not just involve men who are charged with DV, but really all male-identified individuals in this work. And so that this program is open to everyone in the communities. That's one of the things. And then I also just help more broadly with our engagement work with men in the community around our role in ending domestic violence and just various prevention efforts in working with young men and boys in our community on challenging just the foundations of violence, some of the things that you were naming, Anna. I came to be involved in this work, like a complicated question, but like what I was thinking about when you said that was just, I remember being like 11 years old and my mom was almost killed by her boyfriend at the time. She was trying to break up with him and he like pulled over to the side of the road and like started assaulting her. Only stopped because someone pulled him off. I later learned that my mom had a lot more experiences of violence. That was like the first one that I was really aware of. And I think just growing up, I never really acknowledged how much that impacted me, and I don't think we do very often as a society. And so that was just kind of there in the background for me growing up. But, I think as an adult, I got involved with different justice work, different organizing things, but never really examined some of the things that I was carrying from those experiences and was really just running away from it in a lot of ways, running away from my trauma, not going to therapy, not talking to people about it, and just really diving into community work. And I think it was about 2018. I was working at a nonprofit doing lots of different community organizing work. I was part of a grassroots collective of men who were having conversations around our role in changing systems of violence in our community. But also I was trying very hard to not turn the lens inward and take a look at myself, I think, in a lot of ways. And, I, in a really public way, harmed the person that I was with at the time and was asked by my community to go through an accountability process. And so I arrived at our men's education program in 2018, which really just uncovered so much about the places in my life that I'm still unhealed, the things that I need to change, the ways that I'm a lot more like men who use overt acts of violence than I would like to believe. And I think part of going through that program for me really galvanized I think just like what feels like is a reality for so many men is that we just don't see ourselves as connected to this issue in any kind of way. We're taught to be disinterested in it, and we're taught that DV is a women's issue. And so I think going through our men's education program and then later being asked to work here was that kind of first moment for me where I started to do that. And every day since then, it's just been peeling back the layers of the onion. So yeah, and that's, I think fast forward to today, I really just, I'm so grateful to these conversations and the things that it opens up for me, but also just like for the way that I show up for my family too.
Yeah, and I think that there's two things. I mean, there was a lot in there that you shared, and again, as we continue to create new episodes, we're going to dive deeper into some of those experiences that you named, but certainly, right, being a young boy and having that experience of watching your mother be harmed in that way is a common experience for many children in our community, and we don't talk about that enough. I feel like anecdotally, we all probably know that. And by we, I mean everyone in the community, right? We all know that those experiences are happening, and we don't take enough time and space to really think about how we then become adults and integrate those experiences, and then how it drives what happens after that, right? And that's a huge piece of all of our work. And it's also the reason that model that you described about the men's education program, not just focusing on men who have been arrested, but everyone who might be using those behaviors in their relationship, because we know that not all people who are being harmed want to call the police for help. So, if we only focus on people who've been arrested, then we're leaving out a huge number of people who need help and support. And we're also able to sort of broaden the continuum of what is abusive behavior, what is harmful behavior when we don't just look at illegal acts, right? That's a big piece. But then lastly, it also is about normalizing these conversations. And that's really when I, sort of set up the intro for this podcast. I said, like, we want this to become a container for everyday conversations where we can normalize talking about this. If with absent that, and I think what we see in our community at large is that there's a belief or a misconception that this is about bad people who hurt people or abusers and victims, this sort of binary thought about how this plays out. And I'm not sure that it's that simple, right? That the experience of violence is actually so common, and the impact of it is so common and manifests in so many ways throughout our community that we should be talking about it as a normalized experience, but we don't.
And I think that a lot of that has to do with being desensitized, because I think a lot of individuals only understand that they grew up in violence as adults, as they recognize, like, oh, shit, I should not have been seeing any of this. I should not have experienced any of this. I think that's a common theme among adults who are just recognizing they grew up in violence. I mean, I know for like myself, I grew up in violence. I grew up in pretty terrible, witnessing a lot, and then not realizing until I was a lot older, like, I thought it was normal sort of thing, or like everyone's father sort of just left. Everyone's father sort of, drank. Everyone's father, so it didn't, my situation wasn't any different from a lot of the people that I was growing up around. And so when you start to self-evaluate and examine, like, oh yeah, this is pretty terrible stuff as a kid to process.
Yeah.
And then you're desensitized by violence, and then you see it consistently, and there's like that normalcy.
Right. But then in there, the weird sort of twisted thing that happens is that you're also taught that people who do those things are bad, right? They're criminals, they're, whatever word we want to use. But yet here you are having had that experience, and so there's this weird sort of detachment or disconnect. And that kind of gets to what you said, April, about why grassroots community-driven efforts are so critical and why we can't rely on systems to do this work. Now, and when we say systems, I want to just talk about, like, we're talking about the justice system. We're talking about policing, law enforcement as a system or an institution, and how I think probably in the 90s, right, the battered women's movement moved to criminalize domestic violence and rely on law enforcement and courts for safety. That was a concrete move made, right? And it was born out of outrage that no one was trying to protect women, primarily women and children that were being harmed, or that when the police did respond, they were doing things that created more risk for people. So the thought was, if we criminalize it, then we can create safety, right? Which was a total error in and how we understand systems and what they can and can't do and whether they care or don't care. And the bottom line is that systems, and when I'm going to say the word systems of oppression, I'm going to call them systems of oppression, because those systems were not created to understand the complexity of the experience, right? So when you then rely on that system to respond and address it, you're guaranteed to miss. You're guaranteed to have more harm created. You're guaranteed to come up short with what people need to actually heal and feel safe. And so I'm thinking in particular about Tyisha Wayne. who some of y'all that are listening might have seen some of the things circulating in our social media. You might have seen some media reports about her, but Taisha is a Black woman in this community who has been charged with first-degree murder following the death of a person that was her partner at the time. Taisha experienced a brutal beating during that incident, and he ended up dying as a result. And there's a lot to say about Taisha's story, but I think the thing that comes up for me, and this ties to some other work that we've done in the community, and I really encourage folks to look at our website because there's some recordings of events that we've done called For the Love of Black Women. And those events were really focused on highlighting the experience of Black women and the intersection of racism and institutionalized racism when Black women need help and support. And in particular, that often Black women are not seen as victims, they are not believed, they are not afforded the same types of responses that white women might receive, for example. And in fact, are arrested when they call for help in a lot of cases, or are viewed as aggressors because of racial bias and things like that. And so what the work that we've been trying to do is to humanize that experience and to tell the truth about what it feels like to be a Black woman who is experiencing abuse or violence in your relationship and feel like it's not safe to reach out for help. Or to say, maybe they don't want their partner to be arrested. What they want is for their partner to learn to be safer and healthier, and that often is not available. And so I think that's where the men's program and this focus on also men who haven't been arrested is really important, because that provides a tool and resource for folks in that situation. But what we know about systems, court systems, law enforcement systems, is that often things get worse before they get better when victims try to utilize those systems for help. And unless and until we transform those systems and institutions, it's always going to come back to community-led efforts that create spaces where people can find safety in the way that's most meaningful to them. And that's where I think all of this comes full circle, and why we've been really focusing on these partnerships and trying to think differently about how do we design a true coordinated community response to this issue. That doesn't just mean make sure the police are at the table, that prosecutors are at the table, but it means make sure that people from cells who are talking to families who have had women and children taken and murdered are at the table, so that we understand that connection. We make sure that we have folks who have caused harm at the table, so that we have a full picture of what is needed. And the thing about systems is that they don't move easily, they don't change easily. And when you try to insert those things, those systems push back.
And those systems are all based on white supremacy. It's all based on colonialism. And so it's a very Western lens when we talk about systems that are in place currently. So when we peel back and why or how grassroots groups, community-based organizations, or people that are just doing the work in the community already, and why they're so much more effective is they understand you can't just throw people away. And that's what systems do. They throw people away. That is a very Western concept of not actually understanding your community. And this is a very Western way of not having love for the person that sits next to you. It's just your systems of oppression is just it's a black and white, but we live in gray. It's not realistic. And so in order for us to be effective, and what we've seen so far is creating these relationships as community partners to say this is the work that we're doing and we need support. And sometimes that support looks like gas money. Sometimes that support looks like you know, a meal. Sometimes that support looks like a ride. And so within a lot of what I'm seeing, we've experienced is that there is no system set up for women, girls who have, for families and survivors who have lost their lives. And so what it appears to to those of us in this is that we're fighting this ongoing battle alone against systems that have money, systems that know exactly, that are operating black and white. And so communities, that's not realistic, and that's not real. And throwing people away does not solve the issue in our communities.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this makes me think of, and I'm going to pass it to you here, Javi, in a second, but I want to name something that's been a dynamic for us over the years, and that this idea, right, of what do you mean you don't throw away people who are abusive, right? And we hear the word, we call people abusers, batterers. And actually, when we started the men's program, we got a lot of pushback because people were really, there was a small group of people in the community that were really outraged that we would say, you have to have hope that people can change and become safer. And no, we shouldn't throw them away. And in fact, I was trained as an advocate in the 90s to not care about people who were abusive and hope they went to jail for the rest of their life, never to be seen or heard from again. Right? And that model of doing this work has actually exacerbated harm in our communities. It hasn't created healing. It hasn't built safety. And really, I don't remember when this happened or who said it to me, but someone, like, people who use abusive behaviors, who harm people, they're our brothers, they're our fathers, they're our uncles, they're people that we love. And that's not to say that accountability and personal responsibility can't happen, and or that in loving those people and trying to do work to help them to become safer, that doesn't automatically equate to dishonoring the person that they've hurt. Right? That many things can be true at once, and we can hold all of those. We have to learn how to hold all of those things if we're really going to be successful at ending violence in our communities. That's always the question we get, is
Right.
like, how do you stop this from happening? Well, how you stop it from happening is to quit replicating dynamics and ideologies and perspectives that teach us to throw people away and see them as garbage, trash, right? That really cultivating a practice of, just like we love survivors through their pain, create spaces for them to share, the pathway to healing for people who are abusive is to create containers that allow them to process that experience. So Javi, I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that, because it's a complicated piece in our work, and we absolutely, serve men who have done horrific things to their partners, and none of this commentary is to say that violence doesn't matter, or that the destruction that happens to their partners and their children isn't real. But it is to say we can't ignore that work also needs to happen. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think about like the statistics that we talk about in our group sometimes, of like, like in our lives, all men are likely to use violence of some form. Like 50% of men are going to use some form of like physical violence in their life, right? So already we're talking about, not 50% of men in their lives are going to get a DV charge, right? And so like already we're talking about, and we're underestimating the amount of violence that happens if we just quantify it by like laws that are broken or people who are arrested. But thinking about, I think just like what y'all are talking about here in terms of throwing people away, and I know Anna, you and I talk about this often, and just like how that creates so much more risk for people when that happens, right? Not just throwing people away and like going to prison or going to jail, but like the ways that I think in our communities we're trained to throw people away when they've caused harm. And I think the question that we frequently ask in the men's program, right, is like, if we don't take responsibility for this man, as men, if we don't take some ownership and responsibility for the things that he's doing to his partner, to his family, then who will, right? He's just going to go to another community and continue to do the same thing, right? And so until some community takes responsibility for like, hey, like I have a role to play here. How do I talk to this man about the way he's talking about his partner, right? What are the things that I say to him about the order of protection that he got? Like, the ways that he processes those different experiences that he's had. Like, how am I showing up in that? And actually all of that is my responsibility. But I've been trained by my society as a man to look away, to make it a really individualized issue, and to make it someone else's problem. And it's someone else's business. And actually, if I make it my business, I might be worried that man is gonna I'm gonna get in a fight with him. Like those are the things that I've been trained to do as a man.
Yeah, and that you just named is that's the thing that is directly tied to the reason that nobody knows how many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls there are, because it's not my business, right? This idea that that's an individual problem, that's not my role, that's how these individual I'm thinking of the word here, like interactions or dynamics, you get enough of those, and then you have a much bigger trend and pattern in your community that plays out.
And then you see,
right.
So then we quantify, you're talking about quantifying based on percentages. So in my community alone, 90% of the court cases seen in our tribal courts are domestic violence cases. 90%. So if we're talking about quantifying and saying maybe that's, but then I think about COVID, being trapped with partners. I think about how many people do not call the police, how many people, there's all these other variables that you're not even able to quantify.
Right.
But if you look at the numbers alone, if we're just looking at the cases we see in the tribal courts, 90%, 95% are domestic violence cases. And this is not, this is family violence. This is, LGBTQ violence, partnerships. These are people who are in relationships, and then we don't even have the numbers for stalking to be able to loop that in. And so when you're disrupting these systems through grassroots and taking a step back and saying, okay, how is this our collective problem? You're disrupting systems. You're by even having those conversations with just, a handful of men, you're disrupting those systems of accountability.
Yeah, and I think, when I think about Taisha and her case, and part of the reason I did an interview with a reporter after a hearing where a judge reduced her bond. She was being held on $1 million bond. A woman who is a victim of domestic violence, who was assaulted severely by her partner, and I don't take lightly that he lost his life, but she's not a murderer in the sort of sense where we think about how those things play out, right? But I was asked this question about why is Emerge doing all of this? In the 14 years that I've worked at Emerge, we have not ever done a community sort of action to make visible an individual case in the way that we have with Taisha, because we haven't had to, and up until now, being able to have dialogue, create perspective for people about it, that has worked. But there's something else driving this, and her whole story isn't being told. And there were, even sort of failures of systems, like risk protocols that we have in this community that were not utilized in previous incidences. And so then Taisha was not afforded the opportunity to know, she wasn't told what's happening in your relationship is very high risk. You know, people who have experienced strangulation have a much higher chance of being killed later. Like, those things were not told to her. And she was arrested in previous incidences instead of being held as a victim who needed help and information. And that sort of like invisibilizing people is a way of maintaining the way it works right now, which is some sort of arbitrary decision making about who's afforded the privilege of being named a survivor or a victim and then being supported. And, you know, when we did the press conference, when the local task force was created, other than folks who were Indigenous or primarily there, nobody else came. There was a lack of interest in it. There's a lack of interest in Taisha as a human being and the numbers of other Black women who don't feel comfortable calling for help. There's a disinterest in all of the men who might be harming their partners, right? Everyone wants to look the other way. It's not my business. We'll call the police, or, you know, those sorts of responses are ways of being dismissive and invisibilizing. And so, you know, today, and we're about to sort of wrap up our time, and today again was to scratch the surface and have a much sort of broader overview of all of the dynamics at play, all of the things that drive us to do what we're doing. Because I think there are people maybe watching or following along on social media that are like, why is Emerge talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? How is that tied to domestic violence? Why is Emerge having all of these conversations about men? Right? And often what we hear is like, what about women? Right? Like, there's this way of deflecting from the topic at hand. And so I hope that today's discussion was a way of beginning to frame out why we're having those conversations, why we're making visible things that haven't been in the past. And that's, you know, sort of Emerge's accountability historically is we haven't done that. And I can't say that it's in us doing it, I can't say that it's always being received well by people who are working within systems. And so with that, before we wrap up, I just kind of want to afford April and Javi the opportunity to say any last pieces that you want to offer that you didn't get to yet. The time goes by fast, and there's so much to say, but I want to make sure you have that opportunity if there's anything else.
Yeah. I mean, I think just one, thank you for holding the space, Anna, and for having us in. I really appreciate that this kind of dialogue is happening. You know, I think it's a very needed and necessary dialogue space, and I hope that people will appreciate it. You know, I was just thinking about, based on this conversation, you know, violence runs deep and it's generational. Like my mother had a really horrible childhood, like really abusive childhood. And my grandfather, I think maybe 8 or 9 years ago on my mother's birthday, after years and years of just really being terrible to my mother, you know, and I think like in this work I've realized so much of his own probably unhealed trauma, like his socialization that he then took out on his kids. You know, he eventually disowned my mother, and then a few years ago, he took his own life on my mother's birthday to send a message.
Wow.
And, you know, I don't think I've ever shared that, like, in a public way before, but, like, it's just been sitting with me that, you know, like, that lives in me, that lives in my mom, and I have 2 little girls now, you know, and I have a lot of responsibility, not just for, like, how I show up in my community, but also, you know, what am I teaching my kids about violence, about like what being a man is. And so I don't know, I just wanted to share that piece as we're closing out. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to share, and then I'm going to pass it to you, April, is so one of the things that we're working on at Emerge is launching a community-wide men's helpline called Generate Change, which is based in the model that we use in our men's education program, but it'll be open for any man in the community who is feeling like they might be at risk of making an unsafe or dangerous choice, to be able to call in and receive support and talk with another man about what's going on and receive some feedback. That's something that sounds really simple, and it's not something that we're trained to do as men. But more and more when we have these conversations, we just realize how much of a space is really needed for us as men to be able to call in and talk with other men about this stuff. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, you can find out information at the Emerge website. I don't know it offhand, but maybe that'll be in the show notes or something.
www.emergecenter.org.
There we go.
That's what I'm here for. All right.
I guess there's quite a bit. I mean, yeah, we just really did scratch the surface,
Yes.
and there's just so much. But thank you for inviting me to participate in one of your podcast kickoffs. You know, we have a lot of work to do, but it's very reassuring and hopeful that there are other community partners out there that are seeing a lot of these gaps in services and that are trying to provide, because those of us that are in these spaces, we're often at capacity, and sometimes it feels like we're doing the same work. We're just maybe off-centered a little, and so it's really reassuring to hear that there's a resource that maybe IT can't provide, but we know that Emerge is working on. And so, like, I think, you know, Tucson is Autumn Jewett, you know, like this is Autumn land. And so to know that there are ways for us to pass this information along for Autumn who live here is like it's comforting to know. I also think, you know, all of these spaces that we're able to be in include a lot. I think it's important for people to understand that we don't always have to agree on how effective you can be in your own communities. I think just showing up is what pushes for change in your community. And so, like with Indivisible Tono partners here at Emerge, you know, working on this local task force to bring more information and start creating more solutions in our community on the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is vital to this, in creating a healthy community. So Tucson is number 3 in the country. Like, that is insane. And so having the 3rd largest per capita of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Tucson is not something to be proud of. But I think what we also need to indicate is that there's a large population of natives who live here, and they go unrecognized and they go unseen as well. So I think that being able to bring some of these issues to the forefront of the Tucson community, to be a little bit more aware and to find ways to get involved is, you know, we want to make sure that we encourage the listeners and, you know, those that aren't sure. Check us out on social media if you prefer. You can volunteer through Emerge programs. There's a lot of ways to get involved here in the community, and you gotta vote. You've got to vote. You've got to get out there. You've got to be civically engaged, because the people that we elect into these positions of power are the ones that are making decisions. And the only way that we can ensure that our children have, you know, a better outlook at life is we've got to elect the right people, because the power in this country is at the ballot box. So thank you for inviting Indivisible.
Yeah, I want to thank you, April and Javi, you know, first for all of your labor and work to build safety in our community, and for everything that you shared today. Vulnerably, you both shared things that are personal. Thank you for your trust and just being willing to be here and say those things out loud so that other people can learn and other people can think and other people can change. I'm really grateful for that. So at Emerge, we believe that we meet at the intersections of our journeys, where we metabolize trauma, we create change amongst ourselves and our families, and we grow in a world that centers and honors the humanity of all people. Join us as we move forward and continue along the trajectory of shaping innovative, reparative, and holistic community solutions. Thank you for listening. Please like this podcast and share it, and give us grace.